Welcome to the final session of the Narrating the Holodomor conference. We still will have a discussion afterwards and final comments from Professor Frank Sisson. This panel is entitled Next Generation Memory of the Holodomor. And we're fortunate to have with us three very interesting and qualified presenters. Our format today will be 20-minute presentations followed by a discussant and then questions and answers, which we will do through the chat function. I'll start by introducing our first speaker, Karolina Koziura. Karolina Koziura is a PhD candidate in sociology and historical studies at the New School for Social Research and a visiting scholar at the NYU Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. Her work has appeared in European Journal of Sociology, East European Politics and Societies and Culture, and Ukraina Moderna. Her doctoral dissertation is a historical ethnography of the global process of the making of the Holodomor. Karolina, you may begin.
Thank you. I will start with sharing my screen. I hope my presentation is visible. Perfect. So good afternoon from New York. First of all, I would like to congratulate Marta, Bezo, Oksana Vinnik, and the entire HREC team for organizing an amazing conference. It has been like very dense and thought-provoking 3 days. And as we kind of exchange informally, it would be really nice to have this event in person, and we can only hope that this is going to happen sooner or later. So I will start my presentation entitled Silence, Memory, and Transgenerational Trauma in the Oral Testimony of the Great Ukrainian Famine of 1932-33, with some kind of misunderstanding that I think that my title may bring. So my usage of silence memory and silences as a noun suggests that this talk is going to be about omissions, exclusions, and amnesia studied through oral testimonies. And overall, this has been a valid approach of scholars, for scholars of collective memory, who together with studying shared representations of the past, studied also what is missing and not talked about. In my research, I do something different. So I analyze silencing as an active mechanism and a part of everyday micropolitics. Silencing is rooted in interactions, communications, and thought processes. So in oral testimonies, silencing are really this kind of micro moments in the telling of the story of the past, in which survivors try to communicate their trauma, yet they are blocked for doing this. And this presentation is part of my broader dissertation project that I don't really have time to talk about, but this dissertation kind of traces the 20th century long shifting cultural construction of the Holodomor, a process that is transnational in its nature, and that is really kind of centered on power tensions, which are very much occupied around the questions of what counts as knowledge, who is empowered to record their version of history, and how different materialities of our knowledge, so sides of knowledge production, really kind of give power to certain voices while excluding others. So I think that in the last 3 days we talked really a lot about this, and how like survivors' testimonies really laid kind of entered this bodies of knowledge about the Holodomor. So silencing in my dissertation is some kind of crucial mechanism of repression that re-traumatizes the victims of mass violence. So in other words, to put it really simply, information and misinformation or disinformation has the power to structure the collective experience and memory of the atrocity. So in this kind of complicated kaleidoscope that illustrates my dissertation, I'm right now focusing on the upper right corner, so on the oral testimonies. So this presentation today will kind of focus on this complex and much broader relation between power and historical representation. And it's going to focus primarily on oral testimonies conducted outside of the Soviet Union and outside of Ukraine. As you can see on the slide, and I hope that you see the slides changing. So as you can see on the slide, there have been at least 7 large-scale projects through which survivors of the famine were called to testify. I will focus today only on 2. I hope that I will have time to focus only on this, to discuss those 2 that marked significant shifts in the historical representation of the famine. The first one is the Harvard Refugee Interview Project that was conducted at the peak of the Cold War era struggles over power and knowledge. It was organized at the height of the Soviet denialist narrative. I mean, there was no famine. And at the moment of the formation of new Ukrainian diaspora community, due to this post-war migration of refugees from the displaced persons camps. And the project very much mobilized refugees whose new political status, especially in the United States, was still very much fragile. And in discussing this project, I will be following the footsteps of Professor Andrzejewski yesterday, but I will focus a little bit more on this kind of Cold War dimension of the project, and I will discuss the attitudes towards the refugees as a factor really kind of shaping their stories and blocking the stories of famine in particular. The second project that I hope that I will have time to discuss is the US Commission of Inquiry into the 1932-33 famine. The project organized in the early 1980s, a project of very different political moment and socio-historical circumstances. And this was the oral history project conducted under the guidance of Professor James Mace. And this was the moment when the Cold War era struggles seemed to soften. Although this was a kind of a moment of kind of sharpened relations, we could argue. The Soviet denialist narrative was in decline due to decades-long processes of reclaiming the knowledge of Holodomor by diaspora communities. And here I would like to stress that those oral testimonies cannot be really discussed as some kind of separate bodies or sides of knowledge, because they were all part of this kaleidoscope that I started with. And they were particularly rooted in this kind of continuity and complexity of knowledge production about the famine outside of the Soviet Union. Which was driven much by emigres and diaspora communities through published articles, for example, in emigre newspapers, published brochures, letters that would circulate and that were sent from the Ukraine and often published abroad. And then activism of various civic associations like Soyuz Ukrainog Ameriki, for example, or community associations, community archives, commemorative events, public rituals, protests, demonstrations. So this is all kind of happening in the background. Calling witness to testify about experienced violence is a political act that is historically contingent. Certainly, the second half of the 20th century is a time of witnesses, we can call it. And at least since the late 1970s, victims and survivors of mass violence and injustice were gradually given a voice to tell their stories. And probably the most paradigmatic group in this age of reclamation were Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, who since the late 1970s were the ones shaping our understanding of this atrocity. Holocaust testimonies also greatly influence our theorization of trauma, memory, and history and the relationship between them. And as such, this theory based on these testimonies have been applied to understand the suffering of other victims of the 20th century atrocities as well. Yet, testimonies of Holodomor survivors pose a certain methodological challenge into ways in which our theoretical framework, this theoretical framework can be applied. And maybe this is something we can also talk in the discussion after this panel. And first of all, the famine was an atrocity that was not only denied by those who committed, but also the state that brought the violence controlled and restricted any knowledge production about it for the next 5 decades. Not only knowledge about the famine was repressed, but also its memory should be erased. Thus, any attempts to speak about it were subjected to severe discursive cleansing, violent repressions, denials, counter-information, and later counterintelligence actions. So our contemporary knowledge about the famine is marked by this erasure, denial, and epistemic tensions. So this erasure, denial, and tensions that I'm talking about also influence the survivors, who by not finding acknowledgement of their victimhood status for a very long time, not being able to relate to a meaningful framework that would help them to understand their experience, often retreat to silence and block their trauma. To think about survivors of mass violence is also to analyze how the world or the public acknowledges or not their experience after the violence ended. So in the Soviet Union, it was obviously no talk about the famine was possible, but also outside of the country, in the context of Northern America and the United States in particular, while being refugees, exiles, and former forced laborers, the survivors needed to wait a long time for their voice to be fully heard. This is probably a good introduction to the Harvard Refugee Interview Project. So yesterday, Professor Andrzejewski did a great job in discussing like various aspects of this very problematic project. But here I would like to stress that the Harvard Refugee Interview Project, which was organized in the beginning of the 1950s, was very much a product of this decade of instability and Cold War era tensions. It was experiment in the then desired collaboration between academia and government. So in social science, this 1950s was the moment of a behavioralist revolution led by Talcott Parsons that called for abandoning disciplinary boundaries to study the structures, what he defined as the structures of modern society. Social science was perceived as not merely a subject of theoretical inquiry, but an applied field whose members should serve their country. In other words, the duty of social scientists was to work in close relationship with the government agencies. Shaping the anti-Soviet agenda seems to be the most obvious goal at that time. So let's focus on the attitudes of those refugees who were like mobilized to give testimonies within this project. So for most of the interviewers, shared certain kind of disdain to respondents, who according to the methodological manual, and I will draw mostly from this source, should be defined as defectors, and I quote, because they deliberately chose to leave the USSR. Yet the term defector should be avoided in conversation with respondents. We further learn from the manual, because it carries a distinctly negative connotation, suggesting disloyalty and desertion, not only of a political system, but also of one's country. The American interviewers should remember that the refugees are to surprising extent, I quote, products of the Soviet system, even if they reject it. So they are not victims of the system, but they are products of the system. So the emotional tension in the interview, according to the manual, comes from being torn, and I quote, between the temptation either to accept or reject these people completely. Particularly sensitive interviewers find themselves dismissing the entire group of Soviet emigres with such judgment, and I quote, they are nothing but a bunch of communists who could not make good in the system. So from the perspective of the American interviewers, Soviet respondents were clearly the others in the anthropological sense, in relation to whom they felt superior. This was a very Cold War kind of thinking. Refugees' self-identification did not matter. For example, they were all called Russians, even though they claimed or they identified as being Ukrainian. Their negative approach to the Soviet system was used only to convince the interviewers about their recently changed loyalties, and not an indication of some kind of true attitude. And any details about the lack of involvement in building the Soviet system was based on lies. They were all hidden communists, according to the interviewers, that created and still believed in the system. So in this climate of superiority and general disdain towards the interview subjects, it is hard to expect that stories of experienced violence, deportation, and trauma would bring reaction. Still, people kept talking about violence they experience. And stories such as the one you see on your screen about the famine resurface in the narrative structuring in the least expected moments. The fragmented and scattered descriptions cut through their biographies. For them, famine is a distinct and bounded event that marks unimaginable loss, suffering, and grief. Survivors try to describe the violence they experience and witness, yet they cannot really find words that would give justice to their past experience. These stories often lead to the outburst of emotions and do not lead to any kind of acknowledgement. No matter how drastic the descriptions of half-dead bodies, acts of cannibalism, family loss, and devastating feelings of hunger, there are no interruptions in the transcripts, no acknowledgements, no follow-up questions. Let's then briefly move to the second project, which is the US Commission on the Ukrainian Famine. And this project, which was organized in the early 1980s, was really the first attempt to systematically record the accounts of survivors of famine outside of the Soviet Union. So within the course of 2 years, almost 180 oral testimonies were conducted under the guidance of Professor James Mays of Harvard University that were later included in the 3-volume investigation of the Ukrainian famine that are stored now in Toronto and can be accessed there. So this project was a product of very different historical moment and very different social-political circumstances, and this was also a product that was a result of decades-long process of reclaiming the famine and reclaiming the famine's memory and history, but also some kind of generational change within the diaspora. And the culmination of this decades-long process was the October 2nd, 1983. A huge demonstration that took place in Washington, D.C., that brought together Ukrainian diaspora activists and community members from all over the country, with banners exclaiming "Ukrainians against the Soviet genocide" or "Mass murder by Moscow." The crowd marched towards the Soviet embassy. So the 3-volume So the 3-volume investigation of the Ukrainian famine that included testimonies with famine survivors concluded the work of the commission, which duties were, and I quote, to provide American public with a better understanding of the Soviet system by revealing the Soviet role in the famine. The goal behind gathering testimonies was to create a body of evidence through which the Soviet denialist narrative could be countered. As James Mays writes in his introduction, what actually, and I quote here, what actually happened during the famine of 1932-33 is still open to dispute on a number of issues. One way to find out what happened in living memory is to ask people who lived through a given event what they remembered about it. Memory is, of course, not always accurate, but neither is any type of source which historians use. So the goal of the Oral History Project was to add these testimonies to the body of historical records. Thus, the questionnaire that was available to interviewers was organized around key themes related to political and economic dimensions of the famine, including questions of how much food was taken from peasants, who took the grain, how did the famine begin, in a specific area, how many people died in a given village, did anyone hear or see cases of cannibalism, how did the government deal with hungry villagers, how did the famine end, and so on. So the factual drive behind this project, which was very much needed at that time, I mean, there was a need for a body of evidence that would be not controlled by the Soviets to kind of tell a very different story of the famine, did not mean that, so this kind of factual drive did not mean that the interview space really kind of provided a situational and emotional space to work through trauma. Trauma that it should be added was still driven by fear. So many survivors actually refused to take part in the project. Like 2/3 agreed to take part in the project only under a guarantee of absolute anonymity. Rather, these testimonies was some kind of multi-vectoral exchange between the interviewers, whose task was to gather as much factual information about the famine as possible, the survivors kind of trying to tell what is to a large extent untellable, struggling with finding language to communicate events that are detached from the present experience, and describing a loss and grief that is beyond imagination, and finally confronting emotions of guilt and shame that many of them had, and kind of share them with others. And finally, a part of this polyphony of voices is also a contemporary listener to those testimonies who kind of very much hears the discomfort of both parties engaging in telling and listening of the stories. So the Oral History Project of the early 1980s is then a particularly interesting one when we think about this kind of decades-long formation of what Aleida Assmann calls Solidargemeinschaft, this community of solidarity. And this community of solidarity helps survivors to find a space through which they could communicate their experience. It also provided a necessary framework through which they could think about the famine and through which they could think about their experience as an atrocity and genocide being its most recognized form. Yet at the same time, the drive towards getting factual information about the developing famine blocked the survivors to fully immerse in their experience and process the trauma. And I mean, psychologists was also like not a part of the interview team. The stories that were important for survivors and connected with loss, grief, and fear were not necessarily as important for historians who were trying to construct a coherent economic and political history of the famine. Working through trauma, and these are my conclusions, working through trauma requires not only the act of telling, but also of listening. It is only to this social interaction that the acting out of the past might happen. The powerful Soviet denialist narrative that shaped the transnational circulation of knowledge about famine produced a lasting effects that cannot be narrowed down only to 1932-33. On the contrary, its various iterations of this denialist narrative traveled transnationally, informed the survivors, like blocked their trauma, but also determined the efforts through which this past could be countered. Yet this emergence of Solidargemeinschaft, this long process of emerging this community of solidarity, helped to counter this denialist narrative. And through this, the possibility of working through trauma could actually happen. And I believe that Sophia is going to talk about this in her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karolina. Sophia Isajiw is the interviewer and researcher of the oral history project Children of Holodomor Survivors Speak for the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center in Toronto. This groundbreaking project was the first in North America to interview the second generation of Ukrainian Holodomor survivors in the diaspora. She is currently a research associate and assistant to the Director of Education of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. Sophia was an assistant professor of art and art history and taught for more than 15 years in Canada and the US. She is also an award-winning artist, a writer on the arts, a university art gallery director and curator, and a recipient of an Award of Excellence from the Government of Canada for her installation work on Canada's World War I internment camp in Banff. Sophia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you to the two presenters. I couldn't ask for better context for this study that I'm going to tell you about. And I apologize in advance because I'm going to speak quickly. So, does knowledge of a parent's trauma and survival of the Holodomor genocide influence a diaspora child's understanding of self? And if so, how? Does the inherited legacy of the Holodomor, or of surviving it, continue to affect or absorb the children of survivors today? And the children, by the way, are all grown up. You see them here in this slide, and this is who I'm referring to. The research I'm presenting comes from an oral history interview project I worked on in 2015-2016 for the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, or UCRDC, in Toronto. I know some of you have researched there, but UCRDC brought us the first documentary film on the Holodomor entitled Harvest of Despair in 1983, and is an archive housing almost 400 interviews on the Holodomor, including about 200 interviews with survivors of the Holodomor, and of these, with the parents of some of these children that I interviewed. We were looking to create a transgenerational study to record 2, if not 3 generations of survivors of the same family. For my project, Children of Holodomor Survivors Speak, I interviewed 21 children of Holodomor survivors. The project was envisioned by head archivist Ira Yudovinitska, and you see there my small little team, with thanks to the Temerty Foundation for funding the project. Our objectives were to see if the knowledge of the parents' survival and experience of the Holodomor had an influence on their descendants, be that physical, emotional, spiritual, or other. The other objective was to look at what is the descendants' own life story in all facets of their lives? What is their understanding of self and how do they present it? And what is it in relation to knowledge of their parents' trauma? You can read more about the background of the project on the website. A few stats about it very quickly. For background, this is the first oral history project of its kind in Canada, possibly also North America, but hopefully it will spark more because more are needed. I consulted with a sociologist and psychologist in drawing up the interview questionnaire. And that questionnaire, the Holodomor Descendants Network now wants to use, and it was used, a version of it in Minnesota for an oral history project there. And if you want it too, you can have it. It's on the website in the appendix of my paper. So questions assessed. I analyzed 5 of the 51 questions I asked during these interviews. I used the oral history method, which uses open-ended questions that allow people to freely express themselves and draw on memory as needed, because I wanted to see what sets of things would come up naturally and repeat amongst the group. And that's what I will focus on. In addition, I asked them to bring in one thing that would remind them, or anytime that they touch or hear or smell it or see it, reminds them of the legacy of the Holodomor that their parents passed down to them. And that allowed for another level of connection and storytelling and memory to come up and be recorded in a different way. I'm going to point to some of the highlights now, and I call this talk The Bad, the Good, and the Ugly. So the 21 interviewees had between them 31 survivor parents, because some had both parents as survivors. 17 of them were survivor mothers, 14 survivor fathers. The average age of the parents during the time of the Holodomor was 11. That is, the youngest was 2, the oldest was 31. The interviewees' average age at the time of the interview was 63. The youngest was 46 and the oldest 81. All of the children had had some form of Ukrainian schooling as a common denominator between them. And you see their religion there. Here are the children by their chosen professions in life, and you see a good range of walks of life that they entered into. And the first finding, what was very clear very quickly, is that they grouped themselves into 2 categories. That is, whether they had been told about the Holodomor as children growing up and it was talked about at home, or that they had never been told about it, it was not talked about, and they figured it out themselves or found out about it in various ways later on in life. So focusing on the second of these categories first, those children whose survivor parents did not tell them or talk about the Holodomor as they were growing up. Many were brought up as children hearing mostly stories of their parents' lives pre-collectivization, of very idyllic and prosperous lives with land, livestock, bees, windmills, horses, pigs, fowl, carriages, even sable coats and velvet dresses. I was personally struck by how very self-sufficient these small farmers were. They didn't have to go to the grocery store for anything. But they did that because the parents wanted to instill in their children a connection to that earlier Ukraine of their own happy memories, and not have them know the suffering or inflict their own wounds on their children. Several parents were very careful not to talk much about life in Ukraine, so as not to endanger relatives back there in any way, or because their parents had been declared dead in Ukraine, or because they had been declared dead as they fled. Very often survivors who made it here were the only members of a family that had fled, or that were left of entire families or villages. As one descendant said, it was almost like they came to a fresh start in Canada, and they didn't want to weigh us down with stories from back there that might have been hard for us to hear. So the children described these parents as very smart and intelligent, but taciturn, guarded, almost untrusting, suspicious, timid, with few words, malomovny in Ukrainian. As one child said, they do not voluntarily tell you, the parent. You have to pry it out of them, and you do not get the full picture, just spotty bits and pieces, partly because of repressing the experience so that they do not have to relive the emotions and details in their memory. And the other reason is political environment. Under Soviet occupation, you don't talk because your neighbor or your kids can rat you out to the state and you wind up in a gulag. The horrors of that regime are that for survival purposes, you close up. Except for those fathers who were broken by the experience and left the families, I think that was 2 of them, the fathers were all hard workers who did not play with their children and could become angry and irate over Ukraine, although not all had experienced the Bolsheviks and the Holodomor. The fathers tended to get more angry and irate over Ukraine when issues arose, even when it was the mother who was the survivor. So living in fear, having to lie about where you came from, falsifying documents to get into Canada to avoid being sent back to be murdered by Stalin. As one son said, quote, "These were honest, hardworking people, and it ate them up inside to be liars, to lie to me about who my aunt is, my grandmother, etc., because his parent had been orphaned and taken in by others. It made everything they said lies," he said. And another son about his mother, "My mother was all about protecting the family. This is a trauma she lived with. I understood she was not like other moms. She was very, as if broken. She needed a lot of healing." And finally, one other child, it made me identify with Jewish friends whose parents were Holocaust survivors and who found their own identity with little or no extended family, never talking about their experiences much, either to shield their kids and try to protect them from whatever they thought, or because there's a certain callousness or guilt. It wasn't a rational thing. Significantly, especially for parents who absolutely refused to ever talk about the Holod with their children, and they called it the Holod, not the Holodomor, it wasn't until their third generation grandchildren started asking them questions or wanted to interview them for Ukrainian school projects that for the first time, the survivor parents, by now already in their 80s, would open up and their offspring, by now in their 50s, finally learned some details from their parents about their experiences. So the grandchildren became the catalyst for the survivor parents to finally talk about the Holodomor in these families. And there's one last finding I have to mention here, which is that of the parents who did not talk to their children about the Holodomor, numerous of them may have instead talked about the events leading up to it. The brutal rozkurkulenia, dispossession or decolonization in 1929-31 on family farms, where activists took family possessions away from their homes over repeated trips, then took the fathers, then the sons, shipped them to Siberia or shot them, and then mothers and children later brutally kicked out of their homes, pregnant, barefoot in the middle of winter, taking away the husband's sheepskin coat from these mothers, them having no boots, and so on. So these things they would talk about as separate events, but not a word about the Holodomor itself. And when they did talk about these events, it would often be in more graphic ways than the other group of children. So that is a children's DNA going all the way back to their origins in Ukraine. And these are the regions of Ukraine that their survivor parents came from. So if you know the maps of the famine lands, they correlate fairly well. Now we'll turn to the other group of those whose survivor parents did talk about the Holodomor while the children were growing up. Most children would hear the stories at the kitchen table, at celebrations, when others would come over and people would ask, well, where were you in the 1930s? And the anecdotal stories would come out and the children absorbed the information by osmosis in that environment. Through tones and tears, as one of them said. And another, so you listen, you pick things up. I cannot stress enough how growing up in this type of environment left an indelible impression on all the children who absorbed it this way. And because they would have to then put the pieces together themselves like a puzzle, this led, by their own accounts, directly to their choosing professions as historians, clergymen, librarians, and educators, or working in community organizations involved in different aspects of their social and professional lives. Conveying knowledge about the Holodomor was initiated by the parent when it happened. None of the children sat the parent down and asked them about it at an early age. A few tried later in life. But in general, this wasn't possible to do because it was so obviously a painful memory. It was evident how much they suffered. You could hear the pain in their voice, and the children didn't want to inflict this pain. Another kind of knowledge passed on to them was a profound, permeating sense of sadness and loss. Quote, where my father grew up, there is no place left. People ask, where are your relatives? But I have no relatives. They all died. Mother would on rare occasions get a letter from Ukraine and cry. There was always sadness from anything connected to Ukraine. In some children, this led to an early adolescent rejection of Ukrainian things, which later seems to have reconciled itself in all cases, but perhaps one. Where the opposite reaction was for the children to carry on Ukrainian traditions, language, learning, and quote unquote, take on the mantle, as it were, of ensuring a future independent Ukraine. So I'm going to turn now to what emerged from their understanding of self that was common to all children of Holodomor survivors I interviewed, based on the challenges posed by the Holodomor to identity, but also new markers of identity it created. This is what I loosely term the bad. The denial and cover-up of the Holodomor for so many decades was a rejection and denial of one's national and ethnic identity, which gave rise to the following challenges for the children, which you see here on this slide's mind map. I'll talk here only about the first two, that's all I have time for. The top identity marker universal across all children of survivors is a deeply felt awareness of injustice. The survivors' children carry a strong sense of social justice and deeply felt understanding of human rights, which influenced the careers they chose for themselves as criminal lawyers, educators, politicians, and artists, most especially amongst the others. Almost all have been or are activists in one form or another, and are active in various community organizations. In their own words, it even influenced the types of friendships they chose and the interests they pursue. So it deeply affected the social, professional, personal, and creative aspects of their lives. Although awareness of injustice is indeed a positive influence, for some of the vigilant response and activism and constant awareness can be burdensome too. As one child of survivors said, "I sometimes don't sleep at night thinking about injustice, about things like that." So it has affected me, it really has. The second is loss of family. Most poignant of all was how they talked about what it means to grow up without relatives. They talked about fragmentation, not knowing one's roots even one generation back, of having no photos of what were once large families, no place to visit, the villages no longer exist, having no family traditions because of having no family, and therefore feeling orphaned. They talked about there being survival guilt in their parent, and this profound loss coming from the parent, especially at holiday times, which always created sad and uncomfortable holidays for the children each year. The result was that they did not celebrate traditionally, especially Christmas. Not knowing one's genetics also in terms of what might get passed on to a child you might bring into the world, what diseases, having no knowledge of any family medical histories at all, which is a subtle legacy of the Holodomor that seldom gets talked about, but a very real one for the descendants as they entered adulthood, wanting to create families of their own. All of this created residual anger and fear in the children, and also regrets around not having relatives to go to for support outside counsel when needed. When you couldn't go to mom and dad, there were no backup aunts or grandparents to support or advise you or console you. And then the realization that as children of survivors, they have also been victimized by being kept apart from extended families. As one of them stated, "There's a sort of inner rage in me about how dare you have kept us away from each other." Now, these map out the good, the silver lining that comes from surviving and being a survivor. The denial of one's identity, yet its enduring survival, also shapes certain positive markers of identity in the children that they recognize themselves. I'll again talk more about the first two here. So the first is a sense of mission. Across the board from the parents, there is a passion for Ukraine that comes from a mission to be ambassadors of Ukraine, to ensure that Ukraine has friends in the rest of the world that will fight for it so it can rebuild itself. As one child stated, "It's not that my parents were burning nationalists, but they really loved Ukraine. They loved their village, just the beauty and the richness, and that beauty and richness wasn't allowed to flourish, was always a source of pain for them, an injustice, you know?" That mission is passed down to the children. As one son said, "I took my father's words seriously." This mission is about keeping the traditions, customs, history, and language alive and working for the liberation of Ukraine. It includes Ukrainian school, dance, music, all forms of culture, scholarship, and religion. Quote, "I spent more money on the Ukrainian issue than on my personal life in my lifetime. $3 million into a joint venture in Kyiv and more in another joint venture in Lviv." The second marker is resilience. Resilience, and most especially, quote, "the quiet strength and indomitable spirit of women," as one son said. But this was noted by almost all of the children. A marker of resilience is belief in oneself and something larger than oneself. This is certainly true of the spirituality and faith that supported them. Another marker of resilience is that resilience develops out of the challenge to maintain self-esteem. So a degree of resilience is indeed genetic, however, psychology experts still argue to what extent. But that example of resilience in the parents for the children was honesty, hard work, a devotion to the country they left behind, but primarily always a hope that it would be free, quote. And so that was really what they were trying to instill in us, is this hope. And lastly, from another descendant, something was left in the children of survivors. That stock of resilience was inbred in us, I think, and also for future generations. I want for my grandchildren, for everybody's grandchildren, to have that sort of resilience so that if they ever encounter difficulty, hopefully that same strength would come out in all of us as Canadians. These map out the ugly, the not so pleasant issues that the children of survivors defined as community issues that they felt need to be focused on, studied, discussed, and dealt with going forward. So recognition of PTSD, they stated that recognition is important because their parents never had any treatment or support for it. PTSD affects everyone in the family. Thus, further research needs to be done into the full effects of the parents' trauma on the second generation of survivors. As one of the sons said, "My father treated his PTSD with Manhattans." The divisive agent element within community organizations. The children here were referring to KGB and other operatives in Canada that followed their parents during immigration and infiltrated diaspora organizations, causing internal divisions and affected issues like free speech about the Holodomor. This bears further research, although people in the community have always spoken about it informally amongst themselves, especially here in the Toronto community. The need for a truth and reconciliation process. The children talked in various ways about the need to address the issue of collusion via a reconciliation process. As one child stated, "Without that guy in that village who's trying to protect his family at the cost of my mother's family, it wouldn't have happened. It would have been a very different story." An awareness of the risk-taking inhibitions or risk avoidance in individual and organizational life. As one child said, in Ukraine, there were no onlookers. Everybody was part of it. They were either the ones being tortured or they were those few inflicting the tortures. But there were no onlookers. Everybody suffered the same fate. Everybody had to fend for themselves. At every minute, every second, they had to fight for their life. And finally, as one respondent said, "I think the only way you're going to move forward in society is to then come to terms with it and let it go. It's your past history. And then you can develop as a nation and be healthy. Because this constant feeling that nobody understands is what holds us back." That's my conclusion. Many of the children of survivors during the interview process expressed how cathartic it was for them to be a voice for their survivor parents and how much it meant to them to be able to do so. Having knowledge or having no knowledge of our histories shapes our identities as individuals, as a community, and our national identity, and it fuels our own sense of agency in the world. It is my sincere hope that others will study these issues further in the window of time that there is to do so. One of the children of survivors, since I did these interviews and research, has already passed away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. We've heard from three very interesting presenters, and now we will move on to the discussant part of our presentation. One moment, please. I would like to introduce Dr. Brent, and almost Dr. Brent Bezo is a PhD candidate and instructor in psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Prior to graduate school, he resided in Ukraine for 5 years, where he became interested in the intergenerational impacts of the Holodomor. His research area is intergenerational trauma, or when mass trauma experienced collectively by large groups of people affects not only survivors, but also their descendants across generations. In this context, individual health and well-being, families, language and cultural traditions, communities, and entire nations may be affected through the generations. His research investigates the long-term psychosocial impacts of the Holodomor and has been published in academic research journals such as Social Science and Medicine and Psychological Trauma, Theory, Research, Practice, and Policy. And I'd also mention his work has been having resonance in Canada in discussions about trauma within the Indigenous community here. I've seen him cited numerous times, his research on how trauma is passed to subsequent generations. Brent, could you please take the floor?
Thanks, Marta, for the introduction. So I thought for the discussant section, I would try to look for a common theme or element among the three panelists. Thank you very much, everyone, for presenting today. I very much enjoyed and appreciated hearing you all talk today, so thank you for that. But I would like to do that very briefly, because what I'm planning to do is turn my brief synthesis into ultimately a question to get your thoughts and hopefully expand a little further if we have time above and beyond what was able to be presented today. So in speaking, I do note that I had the opportunity of seeing everyone's papers ahead of time for the week. So thank you for those. I thoroughly enjoyed reading those as well. So I'm going to allude to those as well. And I do understand that, people in the audience do not necessarily have access or do not necessarily have access to those. So I just want to note that as well. In reading the papers and in hearing the talks, one element that really came through is that there are different narratives of the Holodomor out there. And how those narratives are produced can depend on different perspectives, different goals, as Karolina mentioned, even different skill sets and training of the interviewers themselves. Different perspectives, different goals, different skill sets and training, even different biases can produce different narratives of the Holodomor. So that came through, and that's a concept that most folks are familiar with as well prior to coming into the conference today. But one thing that really came out of some of the content that was presented today, I did have the opportunity to read Sophia's paper on presenting more in-depth details on descendants of Holodomor survivors and their thoughts and perceptions and viewpoints. And they did mention the importance of recognizing and understanding the voice of the survivor. And Karolina mentioned this as well in her paper in terms of, let me see if I can access my screen at the moment. And Karolina's mentioned, I'm just going to read a couple of quotes. The central concept of my dissertation is that of silenced atrocities. As I hope to demonstrate, the decades-long denial of the famine had a profound impact for deepening the traumatic wounds experienced by survivors. Karolina also talks about the power of the denialist narrative. So here's another narrative that was sharpened through and in relation with transnational Cold War era narratives, further blocked survivors' voices from being heard, and she discussed this in more detail today. And what really resonated with me as well, the last sentence of Karolina's paper that I read, if the painful past is not acknowledged, the act of telling further re-traumatizes the survivor. So this was a common element as well in the work of the panelists today. The importance of acknowledging and recognizing the voice of the survivor. And this harkens back to a few decades ago. One of the first folks who helped to conceptualize the term, intergenerational trauma, multi-generational legacies of trauma, Yael Danieli, and in her conceptualization and research, she talks about this very point, acknowledging the perspectives of survivors and helping to understand what went on in order to heal. From the perspective of the survivors, but their descendants themselves. So that was another issue, but I wanted to bring those two issues together. So on one hand, we have, based on different perspectives, goals, skill sets of interviewers, different perspectives and even biases of writers and hearings, for example, formal hearings. These can produce different narratives. On the other hand, we want to acknowledge the voice of the survivors and descendants as well, as we see in Sophia's work, and help to understand what went on to help. So the survivor's voice and perspective is important. How do we reconcile that if we have all these different narratives, and some of them are very much in opposition to each other? And yet, at least conceptually, if we know that different narratives, even misinformation and disinformation, might re-traumatize survivors, as Karolina noted, how do we reconcile that fact? We have all these different narratives out there. How do we reconcile that fact with that concept of understanding and acknowledging the voice of the survivor, and by extension, descendants of survivors as well. Because some of those narratives might be damaging. How do we reconcile that? And I just wanted to add one more thing to that question before I turn it over to the panelists. And comparatively to other mass traumas, Holodomor occurred, but it took 40 or 50 years before serious scholastic research started to appear about the Holodomor. As a result, as of today's date, most of the survivors have already passed on. So if the goal is today, how do we acknowledge and understand the voice of survivors? And we don't have that frame of reference on the first 40 or 50 years of scholarly study after the Holodomor. We're trying to piece this together post hoc in some way after the fact. That might complicate it even more so. I mean, if we have all these competing narratives out there, we want to acknowledge and understand the voice of the survivor, the perspective of the survivor and their families and descendants to help them heal. How do we do that after the fact in many ways? So that was my first question. If we have time, I have one individual question for each panelist as well. But at this point, I'm going to turn that over to the panelists.
Okay, panelists, would you like to answer in order of your presentations? Karolina, would you like to address Brent's question?
Yes, thank you, Brent, for your comments. I really wanted to hear your comments, and I appreciate your comments. And I also appreciate of it being put with Mateusz and Sophia. I think that our presentations really nicely resonated to each other's, and I think that they really show, on the one hand, this kind of power of the denialist narrative and this kind of really different ways through which and the agency of people who are trying to overcome it, whether through literature or through some kind of live biographies, and kind of really coping with the memories of the parents. So I think that this was like a really nice conversations we had, and maybe just like one point in response to Brent, I think that what you mentioned about this production of very different narratives at the same time, I think that this is something what makes the case of Holodomor particularly interesting. And I think that this is something to what also Professor Naimark yesterday referred to, that we have like throughout the Cold War, we have this very interesting tension and struggles of, on the one hand, like really kind of understanding what happened in 1932-33. We have this kind of urge by the activists to somehow shape the narrative, to counter the Soviet denialist narrative, while also at the same time like giving voice to the survivors to kind of tell their stories. And these are sometimes very different stories for the first ones. So it's a very kind of interesting, complex moment and tensions in which they all kind of come together and are separated. And I think that just in brief comment about recognizing the voice of the survivors, I agree with you. I think that we all talked in a different dimension of the issue. But what I was trying to somehow stress in my presentation was that giving voice to the survivors is a historically contingent process, right? And it's also like a social political process, right? So it's not without kind of reason that in the 1980s something like oral history project by James Mays happened, right? Like late 1970s, 1980s, it is really a moment when witnesses of mass atrocities are giving voice to tell about their experiences, right? This is what is happening with the Holocaust survivors. This was not necessarily the 1950s, right? The 1950s was not the project of giving the victims of violence to talk, because they were not perceived as victims of violence. They were perceived as something and somebody's different. And then in this context, it's like really interesting how the silencing, this kind of repression of knowledge I'm talking about, is really kind of responds like differently to these projects, right? If you think about these two projects which are deeply immersed in the American academia, you see actually different forces that block those projects and block the history of the famine, right? So in the 1980s, and these are all very different moments. From the 1980s with James Mays, it's a really it's a project that kind of appears in this moment when there is a significant shift in writing Soviet history towards like the social history, something like Sheila Fitzpatrick and so on. So the kind of stories that are emerging from the kind of history of the famine that is emerging from those stories are not really being fully heard and fully acknowledged. Yet at the same time, when you think about 1950s, when there is this moment of totalitarian school and thinking about Soviet Union, I mean, still the famine is not being fully acknowledged, right? I mean, social scientists like really kind of are not interested in this. Like historians really do not pick up the topic. Such books as the Black Deeds of the Kremlin are like largely ignored. So it's kind of so I think that it's kind of interesting how all these forces really kind of structure the narrative and make the telling of the stories kind of possible, and at the same time not really, right? So this is on my side, and thanks for the comments.
Thank you, Karolina. Sophia, do you want to move on to the individual questions, or would you like to respond to this?
Oh, I'd like to respond.
Okay.
Brent, the artist in me is going to, that's the $1 million question on one hand. On the other hand, equally important question is, why do we have to? Reconciling these things goes to the question of intent. What is the intention for reconciling them? Where do we reconcile them? There might be an intention for healing, which then is good to have some reconciliation, but also sitting with the different narratives, sitting with the different perspectives and so on. What does that do? What does that give us? It's a very difficult place to sit, but it's a very interesting, complex place to be too, as Karolina's research obviously shows. So I think that to answer that question, you have to answer it individually by intention. And I'm really grateful that Karolina and Mateusz said what they said, because I would say also, you have to let the witnesses lead. You have to hear that voice. The whole point, the whole project is giving voice to the voiceless, especially in something like the Holodomor that was denied and sat for so long. It's almost like we're just rediscovering a lot of it now. And I'll also support Mateusz in the fact that more volume, more of everything is where you start to find the thread of the narrative that goes through all of the different disciplines and practices and so on too.
Thank you, Sophia. Brent, I think I'm tempted to go to move to allow the audience to ask questions, but I'm also too curious about your questions for each speaker. So let's do the individual questions to each speaker.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you. Karolina, you talked about blocked, use the term blocked and silenced memories, and most Holodomor survivors have now passed on. So what does that mean if memories have been blocked or silenced? What can be done, or does this need to be done? Or how do we approach the concept of, unblocking or unsilencing memories, if I can use those terms? Or is this important?
So I received a question about how to unblock the silence or unsilence the memories, and how to unblock the trauma. This is basically the question of my dissertation, which is really kind of tracing this knowledge production of the Holodomor throughout like the 20th century to on the one hand like see the strong, powerful Danielist narrative that is layered through history, while at the same time you have constantly different moves to unblock this narrative, to break this narrative and to kind of unblock this silence trauma, right? Because it's actually since the famine started, you have the efforts like outside of the Soviet Ukraine to somehow inform the world about the famine, right? To somehow break with this hegemonic narrative. So there is, I think, like a larger question here, which is like, what does it take to create ruptures in a repressive histories, right? Like what kind of activism needs to be there to somehow break the denialist narrative. And I think that like the case of Holodomor is probably the most interesting 20th century atrocity through which you can really kind of study these tensions, because I don't think that we have like any other like really similar case on this scale that you would have this kind of tensions between like acknowledging and denying. So in different, like in this kind of layering of the denialist narrative, but also kind of trying to unblock this, it is like through history there are like different moments when the activists somehow, when they manage to like break through and create the ruptures with this hegemonic narrative. But like throughout the Cold War, this was like very much silenced because of the Cold War and what the Cold War was. And what I think that is really kind of interesting in Sophia's work in this sense is that you can see that it was only kind of recently when there is possibility for like a really new story of the Holodomor, right? Because of the Soviet kind of, I mean, Soviet collapse, but I mean the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed doesn't mean that the regimes of knowledge about itself that it created collapsed as well. I think that it's still kind of very much powerful, and I think that is probably even more powerful in the American context than in the European context. But I think that Sophia's work really kind of shows that it really kind of takes time, and it really kind of takes a long process to develop some kind of, you know, community of solidarity, but also to develop some kind of resources through which, you know, this kind of rupture in the hegemonic narrative can be possible. And then I will circle back to Mateusz, which I think that, you know, his stories of this kind of, you know, problems with, you know, publishing these books is also a kind of, you know, signifier that you can actually tell something about, you know, to when and to what extent the history of Holodomor is kind of possible. Right?
Thank you, Brent. Did you want to address a question to Sophia?
Yeah, please. Just give me one moment. I have the paper here with a couple of notes. Sophia, in your paper, one thing that really stood out for me, and you did use this term not necessarily in the context that I am, but this dichotomy. And I inferred from your paper that there was a real dichotomy within families. And by that, I mean, from the perspective of the psychologist, I'm first just going to read some key terms from your paper. So from the second generation perspective, they talked about issues like fear. That was a big one. Fear, survivor guilt, profound loss, for example, sense of inferiority, fatalism. Their survivor parents, you know, had this fatalistic view of the world. The descendants talked about this risk aversiveness that they developed as a result of being embedded in those families. And that point I found particularly interesting because I have not come across that particular impact in the intergenerational trauma literature. So that was new and novel and exciting to read. And the reason it was exciting for me, that particular point, I'm just going to digress here for a bit, because individuals who experience trauma, survivors of violence, survivors of trauma, especially children, survivors of trauma, later on throughout the lifespan, research shows that they do exhibit this risk aversiveness, or they're adverse to taking risks throughout their life. And that stems from their own experience with trauma, because as children, children are powerless if they're being, you know, maltreated, or there are atrocities being perpetrated against them. And if the child reacts, that usually brings upon negative consequences for the child. And they learn not to, you know, speak out, act out, or take risks, because those risks can lead to more severe consequences for them. And risk aversiveness often is prevalent throughout the lifespan. So I found that really interesting to see that in this paper in Descendants, or not the survivors themselves, in the Descendants, because I haven't come across that in intergenerational literature. But anyway, the sense of inferiority, prevalent or picked up on or noted by descendants, the fatalism, the risk-averse behavior, the fear, for example. And in psychology, we would call those risk factors. Developing child, growing up in families with all of these risk factors, we would expect a lot of negative outcomes. By that, I mean things like low self-esteem, high rates of depression, high rates of anxiety, lower levels of psychological well-being, higher levels of mental illness, higher levels of risk-taking behavior, like alcohol use, tobacco addictions, and so on. I don't necessarily see that in the paper. And here's where the dichotomy comes into play. So there's all of these risk factors or negative factors influencing the child, affecting the child. And research is fairly clear on what that does to the developing child. But at the same time, for these adults who were children at the time, they noted an innate tenacity within the parents. They talked about parental wisdom for being able to survive and move on. They talked about a resourcefulness in their parents, inner toughness with their parents. They talked about the parental ability to survive. They talked about how faith and spirituality and religion provided, stronger coping strategies for the children. So what really struck me in the paper was this dichotomy. So these children were growing up in families with all of these, and I'm going to call them, negative